Hello, welcome to Lunch and Learn, the speaker series at the Woodrow Wilson House, which is part of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. My name is Elizabeth Karcher, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's talk. Before we do, as I usually catch up, give everybody a little bit of some news about what's happening at the Woodrow Wilson House this last week. So with that, Suffrage Outside has been very, very well received. We've had over 100 visitors every weekend. We were covered in the Washington Post and USA 9. Other interviewers are coming this week, which is very exciting. So we are extending the hours for Suffrage Outside through Thanksgiving. So please go online, book your tickets, and we will welcome you to the rear garden of the Wilson House. Our speaker series is continuing, so log on for tickets for the speaker series as well. This year, we also have the walking tours, so they are perfect for this time of year. So log on to download your tour and information and take the walk at your leisure. Our vintage game night last week or 2 weeks ago was such a success that we're hosting a Halloween vintage game night on Friday, October 30th from 5:30 to 7 o'clock. So we all have to wear our masks. So now you might as well come with a Halloween costume if you like. It will be our typical vintage game night, but outside. You'll get to see the Suffrage Outside exhibit. We'll have croquet, ring toss, bocce, beverages, and this time we will have a food truck. So you'll be able to have your dinner outside in the backyard, which will be really fun. It's limited availability. You know the rules here in Washington, D.C., 50 people or less. So please go online and get your tickets for that. As I said, we're going to have continuation of the speaker series. Next week is Queens of the Resistance with Brenda Jones, which is super exciting because it's going to be talking about current politics, and we'll be tying it as well to the suffrage movement and where we are today in politics, which is really timely just the week before elections. So just a reminder that we have our scholars program. It is moving along. We've had 7 scholars this semester. We are accepting applications for the spring. So if you know someone who is looking for a program this spring, we'll do it both virtually and on site. Please have them contact me or put their application into the Woodrow Wilson House. A couple of reminders. The garden is a great backdrop for photo shoots and private parties. So if you're looking to have a private party, maybe for the election or the election results, or you want your team or your staff to have a great safe outing to get together and see one another safely face to face, book a time in the garden so that they can, so you can all be together. We have photo shoots, we have cocktail hours. Just let us know. Sarah will be able to help you with that. So also, I just wanted to remind you that we are a 501c3 and we welcome and appreciate your donations. They go to supporting programming like today. So with that, today's programming, I want to remind everyone that the Woodrow Wilson House, we really believe that we need to take an honest appraisal of history, and that helps us understand ourselves as a nation and as a people. And through initiatives that we've had, such as the 15th Point, such as Suffrage Outside exhibition, and other talks like we've had here on the speaker series, we hope to live up to this ideal of exploring all aspects of President Wilson's legacy. So with that in mind, today we have a slightly different setup than we usually have. We have 3 speakers. We have actually 2 speakers and a moderator to discuss a topic. We have retired Ambassador Joel Danies and retired Foreign Service Officer Chris Richardson. They'll discuss the racial implications of the Wilsonian Foreign Service and the experience of people of color serving in the United States Foreign Service. The discussion is moderated by Professor Jonathan Wharton. He's Associate Professor of Political Science and Urban Affairs at Southern Connecticut State University. Dr. Warden is an experienced researcher, educator, and author in public policy, economic development, as well as state and local government. He is currently serving as Associate Graduate School Dean at the university. He's worked on public policy analysis, election campaigns, and archival research in the New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut area. He's frequently called upon for policy analysis for the New York tri-state area newspapers, television news, national public radio, and PR stations. In addition, and what makes him an ideal moderator for today's discussion is that he has a personal connection to the United States Department of State. So with that, let's welcome Dr. Jonathan Wharton.
Thanks so much. I appreciate being here this afternoon. Thank you for the invite and letting me moderate this afternoon for lunchtime here. I certainly find this fascinating in terms of the topic, as most people know, because my family has been in the Foreign Service for generations, including my grandfather, who was the first African-American to pass the Foreign Service exam, Clifton Wharton Sr., and of course, my uncle as well, who was the Deputy Secretary of State. So this is a great opportunity to shine on some of the concerns that we've seen generationally for many African Americans. So, Ambassador Danies, in light of that, if you don't mind beginning with your introductions for a few minutes about your involvement and engagement in the Foreign Service first.
Thank you so much, Dr. Warden, and thank you also for having me participate in this program. This is hopefully this is going to be something informative and educational, and gives us a chance to share our thoughts and aspirations for our nation's diplomatic corps. Just very briefly, I'll tell you, I retired this year from the Foreign Service, in which I had been a Foreign Service officer for 32 years. I have had a wide range of experience, and perhaps as we are talking, I can touch on some of the various places that I've worked, but I certainly can tell you that having had the diplomatic experience for the United States, starting with my first assignment in 1988 in Yemen, what was then North Yemen, and culminating with my role as an ambassador in Gabon a year and a half ago. It's been a great experience seeing the way we manage our nation's foreign policy. But to the point of this conversation, one of the great disappointments has been the lack of representation of African Americans at the senior levels of the Foreign Service, and especially in the diplomat as senior diplomats and ambassadors, where I think we have the ability to be to have quite a lot of effectiveness, and where we can be excellent representatives of what the United States is seen as representing around the world.
And my name is Chris Richardson. I'm a U.S. diplomat, or was a U.S. diplomat. It's interesting you say retired, because I think of myself as fairly young to be retired, but I was in the State Department for 8 years. Before that, I was an immigration attorney, and then after, I've gone back to be an immigration attorney as well. During my time in the State Department, I actually wrote a book about the Civil Rights Movement, the Historical Dictionary of the Civil Rights Movement. And I researched it while as a diplomat overseas. And it was really interesting, because every time I tried to research about the State Department in the process of writing this book, the State Department never came across as a benevolent or good organization. And so that really got me interested in this topic. And so I did a lot of reading and a lot of different research. And I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times that just talked about the State Department's history of racism and discrimination, and how that's really rooted in the Wilsonian era and subsequent to the Wilsonian era. And so I'm hoping that in this conversation, we'll get a chance to talk a lot about just what that era looked like for the first Black diplomats, and how that still has a role in today's world.
Thank you, Counselor. No, appreciate that, Attorney Richardson. And as a matter of fact, that's what sparked this in the first place, was the fact that his op-ed led to a conversation we both engaged in. And thankfully, Elizabeth had reached out to Joel, at least, to get things going for this purpose. So just as a reminder to everyone, certainly feel free to put in your questions in the chat so that I can scroll through it. And I have my own questions here as well. But there's only a few questions just to kind of get things started. That's the first question is, you all certainly have unique backgrounds. So what exactly led you into the Foreign Service in the first place? And was there any kind of mentoring or even exposure to understanding the profession? Ambassador, do you want to begin with that one?
Certainly, thank you. Interestingly enough, part of the reason why I was drawn to diplomacy was a tendency as a young person to talk a lot. And a lot of people used to tell me that I probably would do well in that field. Also, the fact that I'm originally from Haiti, I was born in Haiti, and my native language, my first language was French, also seemed to be something that contributed to people's thoughts. And so I listened to them. And even though in college I started out as a pre-med student, I very quickly gravitated to political science and to international diplomacy. And I have to say that, no, unfortunately, and that is one of the things that I certainly hope to do differently in terms of my role now. Unfortunately, I did not have anyone to guide me or to encourage me. Later on in my career, I was very fortunate to have some very caring and influential people for whom in fact, a number of whom I worked for, who were quite influential in helping me develop my sense of my career in diplomacy. But no, early on, it was just a matter of, well, this seemed like a very interesting thing to do. And finally, the idea of being able to travel on somebody else's dime certainly was something that appealed to me. And I have to say, this is a beautiful world, and having had the opportunity to see so much of it was what really, really made it for me.
Great, thank you. Attorney Richardson?
Yeah, I think for me, growing up, I'll admit, I never even left the country or had a passport till I was 24. My mom was a secretary, my stepfather was a mechanic, and neither of them ever traveled before either. What got me interested in it was reading. I loved reading as a child, and I remember picking up a book about Dean Acheson and Harry Truman, and I just thought it was so fascinating how they worked so hard to navigate the world that existed post-World War II. And I thought, wow, that is something I would love to be able to do, to be a part of that conversation, to be in a room, or as Dean Acheson's book's called, Present After Creation, to be in a part of something like that. And so that is what brought me to wanting to learn more about the State Department and being more involved. But I just didn't think that was a job that someone like me could do. And so my initial start was actually being an attorney. And I love practicing law. I think being a lawyer has been like one of the highlights of my life, but I felt that was something I could always do, right? I remember the moment came when I'd been practicing law for 3 years, and I went to the partner's office next to me, and he said, Chris, I've been here for 40 years in this job, and you're going to be here for 40 years, and you're going to be right here just like me. And I think he meant that as like a compliment, but it terrified me, the very idea of being in the same office with the same person for 40 years. And so I took the Foreign Service exam, passed, and then joined the State Department. And the next thing you know, I was in Lagos, Nigeria. But for me, I think that's what attracted me to it. So I really didn't have anybody mentor me into joining the State Department. But once I joined the State Department, I had a lot of great mentors and people who opened doors for me and really helped me learn a lot and survive being in the State Department, even though it was a great experience for me. It did have its challenges. My hope is that as time has gone on and we've looked at a lot of these ideas, that we'll go back and find a way to ensure that minorities are able to have the mentorship that they need to stay in the State Department.
Great points. Good. I have to also add, it's kind of interesting for me because on both sides of my family, they're involved in the Foreign Service and being diplomats. So I got exposed early on as a child about all this, and certainly being accustomed to traveling. So that's something that I think many people tend to take for granted, but it's so essential in understanding the Foreign Service. Your educational and professional backgrounds prior to Foreign Service really do stand out, on your resumes here. So did it help in some way with your perspective before working for the State Department? Ambassador, do you mind going first?
Sure. And again, I think that's a very important piece. I happened to gravitate throughout my time before joining the Foreign Service into jobs that involve service providing. And I think that was critical, both in terms of preparing me for eventually working in the State Department, certainly as a consular officer, but also this idea of understanding that my role was to serve others, not only to serve my countrymen in terms of how I was representing them overseas. The idea of being a Black American, being able to demonstrate to people around the world who we were, what our value was, what our role was in the United States, explaining obviously a lot of our history in the country, but also demonstrating that the inroads that we were making, and therefore being able to be in a good position to encourage others in other countries to also follow in our footsteps. But again, as I said, I think the key part was my last job before joining the Foreign Service was working at US Air, as a matter of fact, as a customer service representative. And I think those 2 years were just excellent preparation for my entrance into the organization and the work that I've done since.
Thank you. Attorney Richardson?
Yeah, being a lawyer before the State Department helped out quite a bit, especially because I was within the State Department. For those who don't know, there's 5 different cones, and one of them is consular. And consular officers handle issues such as passports, visas for people who want to go from abroad to study or work in the United States. And so having worked in that background and in that field, I had, I think, a little bit of a leg up when I joined the State Department as a consular officer, and really help my colleagues in terms of understanding immigration law and things that, you know, when you go into the State Department, you don't necessarily know unless you're an immigration attorney. And so just from a practical standpoint, it was very, very helpful. But also just from understanding what are things like burdens of proof, because even within the State Department and among consular officers, those change depending on the circumstances. And so understanding what that stuff meant, but also making a quick decision and not taking stuff personally as well. I'll say the one thing about being a lawyer is that you write a lot of stuff that can be kind of hard, and you get a lot of stuff written about you that can be really hard. And so I think, you know, when you're a visa officer or you're dealing with American citizens abroad, you're going to hear a lot of things that aren't going to necessarily be the friendliest things. And so, you know, I think a lot of my colleagues had a hard time dealing with hearing hard things being told to them. Whereas from my experience being an attorney, it was like, well, yeah, I've heard that before. And so it really helped prepare me, I think, for the service.
Great. Thank you very much, Counselor. Well, I just want to send out a reminder to everyone. I'm getting questions already, thankfully. So please make sure that you are adding in the chat your questions, because I'm down to my last prepared question here. And of course, this is key to everything for the lunch here to discuss. Were you aware of the Wilsonian era racial reforms that took place before you even started working on the Foreign Service, or while you were working on the State Department? And what have been some of the lasting implications that surround racial inequality in the State Department? I know it's a kind of a deep question. So Ambassador Danies, maybe you can kind of start us off there with that.
Well, to start off with, I'm going to say that with hindsight, I do understand the experience that I had in terms of related to the policies that President Wilson had reinstituted, the desegregation policies into the federal government, and the impact it had on African Americans, Black Americans in the organization. But, you know, from my perspective, from my sense, when I joined the Foreign Service, I came. It was at the time when there were 2 lawsuits, active lawsuits in the State Department. One had been brought up by women in the Foreign Service for discrimination, and the other one had been for Black Americans in the Foreign Service, also related to discrimination. So very early on, I became very well aware of the fact that this was an issue, and this was something that was likely going to be with me for a good part of my career. Frankly, I also, being the type of optimist that I am, I also had in mind that, well, these people who had come before me had sort of done the hard work and set the ground in a good place, and therefore that was going to be a benefit to me. And while there is truth to that, the fact is that, as an example, I was thinking about it this morning. My second assignment was in Paris, and as a staff assistant to the ambassador. And therefore, I became aware that the lawsuit that had been brought up by women in the Foreign Service was being dealt with because, in fact, we received cables encouraging ambassadors to consider women applicants for senior positions in their embassies, but to consider them with great care. And in fact, there was in fact some legal recommendations or mandates that went along with that. I do not remember ever seeing anything like that related to African Americans and other minorities in the State Department. And I would say again, the fact is, based on my experience and my observations, there's a lot of work left to be done, a long way to go. I think the State Department has done a fantastic job, and still there's more work, but a fantastic job in recognizing the value of women, and in other words, or not making this separation in terms of who we are and what we're able to contribute. But yet, as it relates to African Americans and other minorities, I have not seen that same level of accomplishment.
So the lawsuits you're referring to, Ambassador, the ones that are related to the 1980s, am I correct about that? At least those series of lawsuits? Right, because
that is exactly right.
Right, because yeah, my uncle was involved with some of that, at least Ali Ellison. So, and that was, I mean, he'd always spoken about that. That's been an ongoing issue. Of course, Attorney Richardson, you certainly have been, discussing and researching and writing a lot about this as an issue, about the Wilsonian reforms that took place in Foreign Service. So definitely, if you could kind of take us down the road there in terms of what led you into this in the first place and some of the concerns you faced in the Foreign Service would be tremendous.
Sure. I've often thought about, Wilson, the fact that Wilson segregated the government. The one thing I would add to that is that it isn't just that he segregated the government, it's also that he actually terminated a lot of African Americans, that he ended. It used to be that Haiti was the place that African American ambassadors, or at that time, not ambassadors, but what was the equivalent of an ambassador. The Republicans usually controlled the White House, and they would usually almost always put an African American in that position, and President Wilson ended that. He led a lot of, if African Americans weren't fired, they were demoted. Some of them had their wages decreased. And so it wasn't just the segregation of it. It was also the fact that African Americans were actively punished for it. But I also think, though, that Wilson in many ways just reflected, unfortunately, that era of the United States. And it's important to point out that, yeah, Wilson did this stuff, but it's not like the people who came after him undid them, and undid them fast, because they at that time had given up on Black voters as well, or African Americans as well. I do think that you have to look at it, though, in the larger context, and that's not to excuse what Wilson did, but the fact is that Republicans have been, Black people at that time had predominantly been Republican, up from the Civil War, the end of the Civil War, and the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, all the way until really FDR. African Americans, 80-90% almost always voted for the Republicans, and so Republicans rewarded African American voters by giving them these positions in the State Department. James Weldon Johnson, who was the person who wrote the poem that was the basis of the Black National Anthem, he had been a diplomat and a Republican. He was appointed by Teddy Roosevelt to Nicaragua, and I think he was in Mexico as well. But there were a lot of African Americans who had benefited from the Republican governance because Republicans wanted to reward Black voters. And so Wilson and the Democrats, when they got back in power in 1912, they said, well, heck, we've been out of power for a long time. All you Black people, we don't like you because you're Black, but also you're Republicans, and so we have to get rid of you. And so that also factored into it. And also the fact that, Wilson's base was the South, was Southerners, and he wanted to show these Southerners. And Washington, D.C. was a Southern city. Hard to believe as it is today, but Washington, D.C. was very much a Southern city. And so Wilson very much was enforcing the mores at that time. And honestly, had Wilson not done it, I'm sure that, Republicans had done it, maybe not, they'd kind of given up on Black voters really in TR's time as well. So I think that all has an influence in how the State Department was shaped. And so you had Wilson really putting in those strictures of making sure African Americans were in clerk level positions, the few that could come in. And then even after Wilson left in the 1920s, when you had the Republicans who came in, and ironically on this issue, the Republicans were the progressives when it came to the State Department. Wilson really, when he was president, the State Department, the Foreign Service officers who were president at that time, they really were a good old boy elite club. And it was really the Republicans who saw the weaknesses of the State Department and said, well, post World War I, we need to rebuild the State Department to make it more professionalized. And so that's why they decided to go with having a meritorious State Department, which is in the past, it was much more of an appointment State Department. But the trick is that even though they wanted a meritorious system, what they thought was meritorious did not include Black people or women. And so that's why they still, even with this desire to build the State Department that was meritorious, they still thought, well, we don't want Black people in this job. And so when Clifton Wharton, your grandfather, passed the exam, the reaction wasn't one of joy. It was one of shock and horror, where they actually asked then President Calvin Coolidge to pass an executive order, or write an executive order, specifically barring Black people, women, and people of color. And when President Coolidge, to his credit, said no, I'm sure Wilson would have signed it, but Coolidge said no. The people in the State Department essentially for 20 years blocked any Black people from joining the State Department. And so, when you're building something on that foundation, and you have a foundation that's actively discouraging African Americans from joining, it can't help but have effect on officers later, even during my time. And so you really see it not only in the fact that African Americans don't really know about the State Department, but also in promotion, retention, the exam process itself. All of this stuff was built on Wilsonian ideals of racism, and also ideas that came after him of segregation. And that stuff is still having an effect even in today's State Department in terms of this exam process, and also how the State Department sees itself as an elite guardian of whatever they're guarding, but also the fact that, they think of themselves as being like really smart people who deserve this job. And if other people don't get the job, it's because they don't deserve that job. And so I think that stuff, you can't help but wonder and look at that Wilsonian era and the subsequent Wilsonian era with Harding and Coolidge, and think about the roles that played in perpetuating discrimination that we still see today in the State Department.
And Attorney Richardson, if you can just remind us, and even me, quite frankly, how long it took after my grandfather to see at least an African American to pass the Foreign Service exam. Wasn't it about 40 years? Am I correct on that in terms of what you
20
said?
years.
20 years.
It took 20 years before another African American would come into the State Department after your grandfather. There were a few that were grandfathered in, so to speak, who had joined prior to the 1924 Rogers Act. Yeah. But the State Department felt so angry about your grandfather having passed the exam, and that Calvin Coolidge wouldn't allow it. They literally used so there's two parts to the Foreign Service exam. There's a written exam and then the oral part of the exam. And so even if an African American passed the written part of the exam, they would tell the African American in the oral part of the exam that you don't fit in to the State Department. So they were able to successfully do that for 20 years after your grandfather got in.
So for nearly a generation, everyone, that's amazing, quite staggering. Well, thank you both for answering the prepared questions. Hopefully that gives us kind of a roadmap in terms of maybe some of the themes that will come through here on the thread. And I'm just going to go to the chat box here and highlight a question or two. And so I guess one of the first things we can continue on this is, President Wilson left numerous challenging legacies, whether segregating races within federal service, segregating ethnicities as separate nations within World War I. They are aspects of identifying groups in an exclusionary rather than inclusive way. How do we facilitate inclusion and diversity while not adopting exclusionary groupings internally? And I imagine that's so important for the State Department. So Ambassador, do you mind going first with that one?
Wilson did play a key role, because growing up and learning in history about Wilson's efforts to create the League of Nations and the idea of peace, bringing about a global peace was something that was extremely appealing to me. In fact, till this day, I remain what I term a pacifist, and that's why I believe in diplomacy and in the strength of dealing with our differences through speech and through words rather than using arms. But Wilson was, in my view, was very, in my case, was very responsible for me thinking that way. I'd like to hope that a lot of other people also. So the idea was that, in a sense, the foundation was set. The problem was in the implementation, and this is what we're talking about, in the sense that not just President Wilson, but so many other enablers saw the role of Black Americans, of African Americans, as threatening or as problematic, rather than seeing it as beneficial to the overall goal of what the United States was trying to achieve in the world, and also as tools to be able to help deliver our diplomacy and to deliver the ideals, frankly, those ideals, those particular ideals of Wilson, that is to say, finding ways to bring everyone together and to cooperate. Because, you know, the United States, we have been very fortunate over time in history that our leadership role had been well received, and we had the opportunity to be able to apply so many of these various tools that we represent into this effort, and could be so much more of a benefit to the growth of the planet.
Great, thank you, Ambassador. Attorney Richardson?
Yeah, I would say that if we're looking at improving diversity, or basically building on our legacy, that the first thing we have to look at is retention and mentorship at the State Department, as the ambassador had mentioned. I think it's really important that we look at the officers. Right now, I think there's only 3 or 4 Black diplomat ambassadors. The numbers of Black diplomats has actually dropped in the last 20 years, or stayed stable / dropped a little bit in the last 20 years in terms of senior leadership. And so there's African Americans and women aren't necessarily staying in the State Department. And I think that we have to find a way to build a larger base of retention and pipelines that ensures that you have like a large number of African Americans at the mid-levels and above who are able to actually get promoted. By doing that, you can have them fan out and talk a lot to different organizations and groups and find a way to encourage more people to join the State Department. One of the interesting things is in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, if you were appointed a Black diplomat, you actually got mentioned in Jet magazine, you got mentioned in Ebony magazine. The Black media and the NAACP and Black leaders really cared about the State Department. They really cared about having Black representation in the State Department. And the reason they cared about it is because they wanted, America to reflect its values. And they also realized that if America wasn't right by its own people, then how could they be right by anybody else in the world? And so I think that you really had a lot more passion and care about this issue, even in 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago than you do today. And so I think what you really need to do is find a system that encourages more African Americans to stay, reward those African Americans who stay, not necessarily just by the fact that they're African American, but find out why they're quitting, why are they leaving? And what can we do to make sure that they want to stay and also bring them back? Look, if the State Department spends, I think, $100,000 to $300,000 per officer, just so if you include housing, language learning. But we spend like between $300,000 and $500,000 per officer. Now, if $500,000 walked out of Facebook or Google or some company, that company is going to start asking questions. The State Department just instituted exit interviews back in April, basically. They're really now just starting to have this conversation about why minorities might not necessarily be staying in the State Department. So I think that any kind of idea of bringing more people in has to start with looking at the people you already have, how you're treating them, and how can you ensure that they are treated well enough that they want to actually go out and promote the State Department to bring more people into it. So I would say that's the first thing. The second thing is I think that we have to talk about what are the instruments by which we bring people into the State Department. When the Rogers Act, which professionalized the State Department, started in the 1920s, there was a belief in Congress and among the American people, mostly among Congress, that the State Department was an elitist snob organization of only wealthy people. And I think Congress still has that perception today. And so we need to ask questions about, well, on what meritorious basis do we allow people in the State Department? Do we have parts of the examination process that weeds out Black people, similar to the way we had it in the 1950s and 40s? Do we have internal biases or subconscious biases that we don't realize that really makes us want a white State Department and not want to attract people who are different? And so I think that those are like the first two things I would think. One is retention, and then two, I think Congress needs to investigate and invest in this issue, just as they did in the 1920s to make the original Foreign Service Act.
No, that's such a good highlight, at least. Please, Ambassador, go on ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to add something to that. There's a structural component to it also. Let's remember that Foreign Service is a pyramidal entity, and therefore, as you rise up through the organization, there becomes fewer and fewer spaces, and actually the elbows become sharper and sharper as there's more competition. I think we are now in the 21st century. The State Department, the Congress needs to look at that issue, the process, the structure of the organization. To sort of paraphrase Tom Friedman, there's a necessity, I think, to flatten the institution more than it is now, to allow for greater opportunity for everyone, because we are at a stage, I mean, as the Black Lives Matter movement is showing, we are at a stage now where we should not be measuring each other based on the color of our skin, but in terms of what we are, our competencies. And I guarantee you, anyone who enters the Foreign Service, the majority of people who are enter the Foreign Service or in the Foreign Service are quite competent, regardless of their racial makeup or gender.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate certainly what Attorney Richardson's offered here is that by highlighting even backgrounds through even Black media or just media in general could be an awesome exposure and a reminder of, look, this is a possibility for future generations. You know, it's kind of interesting because you reminded me of all the clips that were done in Jet and Ebony of my uncle and so my grandfather, so many of them. And you're right, it's interesting to see that in the period of the 60s, 70s compared to today. We don't see nearly as much attention focused on that. And I think that could be very helpful in inspiring a new generation. As a matter of fact, speaking of that, I'd like to get to this question because I know it's certainly one that Elizabeth Karcher has brought out to us in our conversations. There's been an exodus over the past years, particularly of senior FSOs of color, as well as new students who are reluctant to take the exam. What do you imagine will be the impact of moving forward, especially on mentoring younger FSOs and continually? And what conversations have been taking place within the State Department to address this issue? Chris, I know you've been following a lot of this, so do you want to go ahead and go first with that?
Yeah, like I said, I think that retention has to be the basis on any kind of reform that we do in the State Department. I really think that we have to look at, and as the ambassador said, we really do have like this situation where it's very much of a pyramid scheme. Not a pyramid scheme, that's a bad word, but it is a pyramid in that to be able to rise to the top, elbows get sharp and things get rough. And I think that some groups might be more equipped to deal with that kind of that need to push an elbow and right your way to the top at the expense maybe of other people. And I think that we just have to have like a longer conversation about how we get that, because a lot of African Americans just feel that the State Department isn't their State Department. And I think that a lot of white officers and other people of the majority don't think of it that way at all. I tell people that I just finished George Packer's book on Richard Holbrooke, who was like a preeminent US diplomat. And, you know, in 700 pages, I think that there was only like one African-American mentioned, Susan Rice, and I wasn't someone he liked at all. And the fact that you could go 40 years in the State Department and have no awareness of race or have no awareness of Black people beyond just like outside of anything, that says a lot about the State Department and where it is as an organization. I often tell people that when I was in the State Department, you know, I had people who would say kind of just dumb things. Like they could tell me the different opposition leaders of every country I lived in, but they couldn't name like a Sandra Bland or Trayvon Martin. And it made me wonder, well, who is it that you represent, right? Like if you don't know the basic things about what's going on in your own country, then how do you represent America or definitely talk about America from abroad? And so I think though that retention component is really important. And making sure that African Americans feel that they're actually welcomed in the State Department, and women and other people of color as well feel that the State Department works for them and that they can therefore work for the State Department. So that'd be my number one advice for that kind of thing.
Well said, Counselor. Ambassador, I imagine you have a lot to offer on this subject too.
Well, I completely agree with Chris, and to his point, I mean, you go where you're wanted. And if you find yourself in an organization that, you know, it starts out, I would like to think that most people who are drawn to this career start out very much like me, seeing the possibilities, seeing the interests, seeing the ways they can contribute. And you find yourself in an organization, that organization doesn't value you, doesn't endorse you, doesn't support you. Now, we can touch on some of the reasons why, or I will right now. Some of the reasons is, like Chris says, it's almost an issue of invisibility. It's not active. I'm going to not address you or deal with you. It's a more or less, we talk about this all the time about being in the boardroom. If everybody in the room looks like you, well, then that's who you are relating to, and that's why so many of our regulations over the past, including the 2 lawsuits, were brought about to try to force that change in order to make the process much more welcoming and much more inclusive. Why are so many of us not being attracted to the State Department longer, or not staying in the State Department? Because it's an institution, as Chris was saying, that really, it's not a matter of being special. You don't have to treat African Americans or minorities or women special. You just have to treat them equally. And that has been lacking. And as you were saying, Holbrook is a perfect example where you have these very senior diplomats, and they would turn to people who they thought they could relate to. And of course, just as an example, I'll say, not that there was any issue here, but I'm not the kind of person that Richard Holbrook would see that he can relate to.
Good point.
Amen.
Good point. Well, I guess since you all bring out some notable figures, I'll go a little bit historical. Chris, I think you're going to like this one. How did Grover Cleveland, the only post-Civil War Democrat president before Wilson, treat African Americans in the State Department during his 2 non-consecutive terms? You want to?
Yeah, sure.
History.
Think about the Democrats. Is like I said, the Republicans were very much the party. Well, to the extent that you could be the party of Black people, they were the party of Black people in that period. And in that period, the Democrats were very much a white man's party. In fact, I think in 1868, the Democratic motto was the Democratic Party, a party for white men. And so they were pretty obvious in how they felt in the 1860s and 19. In fact, there's this really interesting thing, between Lincoln, between really Andrew Johnson leaving the White House in 1868 and Grover Cleveland winning in 1884, there hadn't been a Democratic president. And so during that period, the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments had passed. And so when it looked like Grover Cleveland was going to win in 1884, there were a lot of African Americans who were terrified. They thought that he was going to repeal the 13th Amendment. So just imagine being an African American in that period where you have the first Democrat who wins, and you're terrified that he's actually going to put you back in slavery. But he didn't do that. But he was very much a friend of the South and very much removed African Americans from positions. Obviously, the Foreign Service, he removed as many of them as he could. But even in patronage jobs, he very much removed African Americans from post office jobs and other jobs and replaced them with white Southerners, because the white Southerners were the ones who got him in the White House. And it's really fascinating that both Grover Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson are often thought of as reformers, but when it came to issues of race, they were the exact opposite. They didn't believe in reforms at all. In fact, they were very much supportive of Southern white people and Southern whites who voted for them. And therefore, they mostly looked at a dim view of segregation. And so Grover Cleveland was just as hard on Black people as Woodrow Wilson was.
Good, great points there. I'm always emphasizing that to my students, especially during that period, because the parties obviously aren't quite what they are today. And certainly we can't forget that post-construct, at least in Reconstruction afterwards, the effects of that. Yeah. Joel, do you want to add into this as well, historically speaking there?
We've been fortunate in the last few decades of having had secretaries of states, some secretaries who demonstrated, like for instance, George Shultz, Colin Powell, of course, who've demonstrated that there is means of overcoming some of this historical impediments that our country has experienced, that the institution of the State Department has experienced. And so my view is that it's very important for us to, both from a historical standpoint, but also as we go into the future, to take a page from their books and to encourage future leaders going into these organizations to follow in their footsteps and to continue doing this this work that they tried to implement in order to overcome some of the impediments that Chris was talking about.
Great. Well, so I'm going to come out of history and get a little bit more personal with a question or two, if you all don't mind that. Just kind of a change up, because otherwise I'll just continue asking history questions, which I have no problem doing as a political history professor. Heck, I do that already for a living, but I think this question is very poignant. Did you ever have an incident during your foreign service career where your race was an issue or affected your performance or ability to do your job? Attorney Richardson, you want to go ahead first with that one?
Sure. Personally, I think that, yes, there was one or two incidences or multiple incidences where your race is going to play a role, especially when you're in other countries, right? And so oftentimes when I would be on the visa line, or I was trying to help an American citizen with a passport or a visa, they would sometimes, if they didn't like the decision I made, they'd say, well, I want to go talk to a real American. The perception being that because I'm Black, I'm not a real American. And so, like, I think that that's just something that you always battle with within the State Department, no matter what post you went to, is that you'd be in some countries and they would see you, or even like when I was in Nigeria, there are chat boards that talk about the different officers at the State Department. And in one chat board, they said that I was a fake American Nigerian, where they said that I was actually a Nigerian faking being an American citizen. And so, and also, like, so that you have that discrimination sometimes you have from visa applicants and people in the general country you serve in. But also within the State Department, yeah, there were some officers who would say the most awkward things. I had one officer who asked me, he said, like, oh, aren't all Black people in South Carolina on welfare? And the sad thing is, and the frustrating thing is that we all know officers like that in the State Department. All of us do, who would say crazy things like that. And we would just say, oh, that's just Mark being Mark, or that's just John being John. And really, there would be no consequences for what officers would say or do. And the fact that so many officers have EEOC complaints against them and they still get promoted to stuff, that's really not factored into the State Department's decision in terms of promotions. I think that stuff, I think about it on a personal level. But I also say that, it actually benefited me as well, being a Black person and going to organizations and people as well, because I think that I, educated my fellow officers on things that they might not have been aware of. But also I talked a lot about civil rights, and I would go to people and I'd go to these, like, I do civil rights talks based on my civil rights book during Black History Month or MLK Day in my post. And the question I would always get from people is that America is this slave-holding, racist, bigoted, terrible country. And how can you represent such a horrible place? And I would say, look, the same country that produced Robert E. Lee is the same country that produced Abraham Lincoln. The same country that produced George Wallace is the country that produced Martin Luther King Jr. And so, like, you have like this country that, yes, it's produced some awful people, but it's produced some great people that we admire and respect in the world. And that's why I ultimately love my country, and that's why I can be here as a Black person who have been descendants of slaves and slavery and segregation. And I can tell you that America is still that shining city on the hill that does its best by its people and tries to do better. And it is a country that puts 2 steps, forward and 1 step back. And that's just the process of what our country goes through. But at least we're moving forward, and at least we're trying. And I would always tell people, as a Black person, I'm up here telling you, yes, America does have these problems, but America is still, in my estimation, the best country in the world. And so yes, I did face discrimination and racism. I saw that stuff in State Department and outside the State Department. If you're a Black person in America, you're going to see that kind of stuff everywhere. But it hasn't dimmed my belief that our country is such a wonderful country, and that our people are such a great people, and that yeah, America's all these horrible things, but America's all those great things too. And so whenever people ask me, like, did you see racism and discrimination? Yes, but I also saw a lot of hope and a lot of things that made me realize, and continually reminded me what a great country that we've inherited from our ancestors, and God willing, we can leave it to our children an even better place.
Well said. I'll tell you, Attorney, you sound like you're in my class already, even lecturing it, because I'm oftentimes speaking about the paradox of America. And unfortunately, many Americans don't even recognize it, that we have these paradoxes historically, economically, politically, and socially, and it just needs to be brought out more often. What a better way than to face that, obviously, abroad. Obviously, I know, Ambassador, you have seen a lot of this up front for years. So, and I can only imagine over the time period before your retirement. So would love some insight on this too.
like Chris, my story is quite multifaceted and also both ups and downs. I mean, the thing about, unfortunately, thing about racism is that quite often there is an invisibility to it. So that from the standpoint of from the standpoint of a young African American officer, one of the ways you can measure your success in your organization is to compare yourself to your classmates, those that came into the organization at the same time as you did, and you look at how our careers are progressing. And I was very fortunate that I cannot say that I have ever experienced what I would call overt racism in the organization, but I do believe that my career path was certainly impacted by the color of my skin, and not in a positive way in terms of the organization. As you can see, I had a fantastic career, so I'm not in a position, I'm not complaining about it, but I'm saying that perhaps there are other opportunities that I could have had access to that I didn't, as a result of how I was seen, as opposed to being appreciated for what I did and who I was. And that's one. But on the other hand, again, as Chris was saying, well, let me quickly add that a lot of the success in my career was also the people responsible for it were African American and Black Americans in the State Department who took quite an interest in my performance and my capabilities, and were very gracious with their energy to support me, to guide me, to give me advice. So we have that. But the other side of it, again, to Chris's point, when I was overseas, being a Black American was actually a fantastic asset. It allowed me to be seen as less threatening, actually, because remember, the great majority of the world, their experience with colonialism is not with dark people. I mean, we could talk about Africa separately, but I'm talking about globally. And so therefore, the idea of a Black American diplomat was, if not a something of interest to be able to engage with, but certainly I believe I was viewed initially as less threatening, which gave me the opportunity as a diplomat to be able to do the job that I'm there to do, which is to engage with people, to have them be receptive to the message that I am trying to impart to them, and to have them to be willing to engage with me in more on an equal a level of equality, rather than either seeing themselves as either less than I was or greater than I was. And so this is why I want to encourage more minorities, African Americans, Latinos, to enter the Foreign Service, the diplomatic corps, because I think they would be as effective as I believe I was in their engagements outside of the United States.
Great. So we only have a few minutes left. Just as a reminder, is any kind of burning question out there you want to add to this, please put that in the box. I want to ask this one at least. Any reflections on the Pickering Fellowship program? Attorney Richardson, do you want to go ahead and discuss that a bit?
I think that the Pickerings and another program called the Wrangell Fellowship are the #1 pipeline for bringing people who are diverse into the State Department. And unfortunately, it goes back to our culture as a State Department that many of them don't feel welcome, and they don't feel supported in the State Department. And so again, it goes back to that issue of changing our culture of the State Department and retention. That, yeah, I think it's great that, we're doubling the number of Pickerings and Wrangells, that we're using this as a pipeline to bring in more minorities. But I think, one, that pressure shouldn't all be on them. One, we should, as a State Department, we should find a way to bring in people outside of the Pickering and Wrangell who are diverse. That shouldn't just be our only pipeline for diversity. And second, even when we get them in the State Department, we have to find a better way at mentorship, find a better way at retention, and making sure that they feel welcome in the State Department, because many of them, they have a much lower retention rate because they felt that when they get to the State Department that what they were sold on isn't necessarily what the State Department is. And so I think it's a great program, but we need to do more to help them when they get in the State Department, and also making sure that we protect them when they get into the State Department.
Let me also add that my alma mater, Howard University, they have a very similar program too. Also, the Wrangell scholarship, at least for that kind of opportunity too. And I think few people know he's actually a Wharton. He's actually a cousins of my family. So small world that way. But in terms of what he's been trying to do and establish, has been tremendous. It's been a good starting point. Joel, do you want to add to this too about the Pickering or other fellowships that can help?
I can't tell you how much of a fan I am of both of those programs, of which I was quite aware, and I participated in the recruitment effort, the selection effort. I managed officers who came in through that program, and just the highest caliber of individuals, just so impressive. But I can't wait until those programs end. And by that, I mean that, as Chris was saying, we want to see a situation where everyone is being treated for their competence equally, regardless, that they do not have to go through a program that is being set up in order to demonstrate the weaknesses of the institution's recruitment process. Because there is no reason for more Black Americans, more Latinos, more women to not see the way they can contribute to our nation's foreign policy. The impediments that are set up, as we've been talking about, the structural ones, are what caused the necessity of a Wrangell and a Pickering program. But I really am looking forward, and I hope, again, I keep talking about the 21st century and an opportunity for us to really do things somewhat differently and do them better by learning from these past experiences of 100, 120 years of history. I'm really looking forward to, and I want to contribute to us being able to improve on that circumstance. But until they end, these are fantastic programs, and young people should be always looking to them to find ways to engage and enter the organization.
Well, thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, Counselor, for sharing with us your perspectives, certainly your experiences. It means a lot. As I said, you're giving me a lot of memories as well, just in terms of family and even my personal experience through a lot of this. And even as an academic, I think this is impactful. And hopefully, I would hope that as you both are offering, future generations recognize the importance of history and some of the elements, some of these policies, certainly that took place during the Wilsonian era and since, and what it all means and its implications. So, Elizabeth Karcher, please feel free to go on ahead and wrap things up for us. Thank you.
Yes, gentlemen, thank you so much. You are truly citizens of the world, and I am very pleased and honored and proud to have thought that you have all represented the United States. So I thank you for your service to the United States, and I thank you for today and your candor and your explanation, and also for your call to action of things that we can do differently and inspire the next generation. So I thank you again today, appreciate it. And I hope we'll have you come back to the Wilson House, and that soon we'll be able to welcome you live in our library. So with that, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.